And hi everybody, welcome to Fresh Outlook, the show where we're talking about what you're talking about. I'm your host, Taryn Winter-Brill, but just call me TWB. On today's show, we'll begin with the NYPD's stop and frisk policy being challenged in federal court. We'll discuss the latest and both sides of this extremely controversial debate. We'll also touch upon mass incarcerations in the United States. We'll discuss the consequences and the community response. From there, we'll change gears and examine Iraq 10 years later. This week marks 10 years since we invaded Iraq, so consider this. Is the Middle East any safer? We'll take a look back at the last decade and what it's meant for the people of the U.S., Iraq, and the world. But before we get the conversation started, as always, let's meet our all-star panel. Let's start with John. Introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Professor John Patakis from Seton Hall University, and I teach criminal justice on a regular basis there.
Terrific. Your expertise will come in handy for this topic, no doubt. Kirk, welcome.
Hi, Taryn. Welcome. Thank you.
You're welcome. I haven't done anything, but tell us where you're from.
I'm from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm the director of the Gold Ring Reentry Initiative. I also teach mass incarceration at the University of Pennsylvania as well as Temple University.
Terrific. I am a UPenn grad, so
Great.
Go Quakers.
Yeah.
High five. All right, no bias or prejudice. Dee Dee, you know you're my favorite. Just teasing. My fellow lady in green, welcome. Tell us where you're from.
I'm a political and cultural commentator, former aide to President Bush, and a blogger.
Terrific. All right, guys, we'll get the conversation started in just a moment. But first, the civil trial began this week in federal court, examining the controversial tactic known as stop and frisk by the NYPD. Let's take a look.
The stage has been set for one of the largest class action lawsuits in recent years. On trial in federal court, New York's controversial stop and frisk. Lawyers for the men suing the city say the NYPD practice of stopping, interrogating, and sometimes frisking residents, all without a warrant, is both racist and illegal. They want court oversight to monitor how the stops are conducted. The numbers help paint a picture. New York City police have completed over 5 million stop and frisks in the past decade. Out of nearly 700,000 occurrences last year, 87% of those stopped were Black or Latino. The fiercely debated tactic has grown into a city flashpoint. Mass demonstrations, city council hearings, and candidates running for mayor have all called for its reform or complete abolishment. However, defenders of stop and frisk, like New York's Mayor Bloomberg, say it's a needed tool for keeping down crime. Opponents reject this claim and argue that any time the police profile people based on their identity, it only leaves the city more dangerous and divided. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, protests over the death of Kimani Gray, the 16-year-old Flatbush resident killed by New York police, continue to draw attention. Gray was shot by 2 officers in East Flatbush on March 9th after police said he pulled a gun on them. The officers who shot Gray have been sued repeatedly in the past for the abuse of stop and frisk and similar civil rights violations.
All right, a lot to get to in a moment, but first I want to introduce Carl Dix. He should be joining us via Skype. Welcome, Carl. He's the co-founder of Stop Mass Incarceration Network. So welcome, Carl.
Thank you for having me on.
Terrific. Panel, what are the plaintiffs hoping to achieve in this case? What are they hoping to get? And stop and frisk, do we support it? Are we against it? Who wants to take it? John, let's start with you.
Well, they just mentioned either abolish or reform. I think reform is in order. Public safety is the overall goal of criminal justice. So if there's reasonable suspicion that somebody may be carrying a weapon or whatever, and if you follow the guidelines and further training, perhaps refreshing, there was supposed to be a closer auditing of all those, which apparently didn't take place. So it's the officer on the street who's responsible to do that, but it's also the officer who's his supervisor. All right, there's a theory of respondent superior in criminal justice, which means that the superior officer is responsible for the actions of his or her employees. So it's a multifaceted thing. It's the officer on the street, the supervisor who has to monitor it, and where there's enough reasonable suspicion to think that somebody may be carrying a weapon, then I think with those type of controls, it can be adjusted and effective.
Is this effective though, Kirk? I mean, what's your position on stop and frisk?
I personally don't think
it's
it works.
effective in criminalizing people. That's what it's effective at.
Okay.
And it's a fish that stinks from the head, from Ray Kelly and Mike Bloomberg on down. It is aimed at targeting Black and Latino youth, treating them like criminals, guilty until proven innocent, if they can survive to prove their innocence. It needs to go.
But Carl, can I interrupt you for a second? Opponents will say it's not aimed at Black and Latinos. That's where crime is most prevalent, in those communities. How do you respond to that?
I respond to it by citing who actually ends up getting stopped. 90% of people who are stopped are found to be doing nothing wrong. That's one thing I'd say. And then the other thing is, if you're stopping innocent people, you're clearly not doing it on the basis of any suspicion of criminal activity. The suspicion comes down to the being Black or brown, and wherever the cops deem you shouldn't be.
Well, some might, the stats say that, Carl, the stats say that crime is down. It's the lowest numbers in recent years. So I just want to bring our other panelists into the mix, Kirk.
Well,
Louis Farrakhan can take the same numbers and say his Million Man March was the reason, because crime started dropping around the time of the Million Man March. He'd be wrong, but he could make the same argument that the supporters of Stop and Frisk make.
Okay. Kirk, what do you think?
Well, I think it's a false correlation. I think we're trying to say that Stop and Frisk has reduced crime, and it really hasn't. Like crime, violent crime specifically, has been dropping, for decades. If you look at states that actually don't employ Stop and Frisk, their crime rate is also decreased. So I think one thing is there's this false correlation that we're trying to make. And I think the second thing is that we really need to look at this in a broader context, right? So to look at mass incarceration, look at how many people have been incarcerated in the last few decades specifically. We went from a prison population of 200,000 in 1970, right? It took us a few hundred years to get to 200,000, but then it only took us 2 decades to get to 2.3 million. And that's because of policies, specifically the Rockefeller drug law, specifically our Get Tough on Crime strategies that we've utilized. And it's predominantly focused on people of color. And all the research says that everyone uses drugs.
Right, we're going to get to that a little bit later, but let's just back up for a second. Let's discuss exactly what Stop and Frisk is and how is it different from being arrested. Who wants to take that?
Well, you're not actually arrested. I mean, there's reasonable suspicion, all right? So if we don't find a weapon on you and we frisk you and we don't find any contraband, then you're released. So you're not under arrest or whatever, right? But
what is it? It's stopping someone who's a...
Yes, but again, it depends on the situation. In other words, if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and it's a high drug trafficking zone and somebody's loitering in front of there with a package, then that's reasonable suspicion to see, what are you doing out at 3 o'clock in the morning in this drug-infested area, et cetera. Now, whether you're a minority or not, that person should be stopped and frisked.
Sure.
The reason maybe that there's so many minorities is because what you do is direct police patrols to high crime areas. So if the high crime area has a lot of minorities, of course, didn't Giuliani do that to clean up Times Square?
Sure,
he directed
of course
patrol.
He did. Right, we haven't heard from Dee yet, so what's your opinion, Dee?
Look, I think Ray Kelly's fantastic. The crime is low in New York, and for such a big city, we should applaud that. So Stop and Frisk is part of the program.
One second, Carl, let her finish.
It's part of the program, and you're not arresting people, you're checking out its activity, and it is not race, it is not identity, it's what they're doing. And I think it's good. I feel safer because people are stopped and frisked. Okay, do they have guns or not? We have this at TSA, we have this at the airport. It's basically monitoring. Now, there may be a couple of cops that are getting a little too frisky. Not good.
Well,
you have bad apples in every program. But it is a
department.
good program because we have a safe city that's so large. And, I don't think it's, I don't think it's a bad thing.
Let's go back to Carl for a second. Carl, can you speak to this idea of how it feels to be stopped and frisked? Can you put it into words?
Let's go beyond how it feels. See, because what you're talking about here is people who are stopped because of the color of their skin. That's what it comes down to.
What are you talking about?
How can you prove that? That's such an arbitrary
Let me
statement.
tell you, I know something about this.
What do you know? Tell us.
When I protested Stop and Frisk in Queens, we got arrested for protesting. We got held overnight. I was in jail with 50 other people. 4 of those people were in jail because they got stopped and frisked and did not have an ID on them. That's the reason they were arrested. And I know this because they got released whenever they were able to get someone to bring their ID down.
But that's an isolated incident. It doesn't speak to the generalization of Stop and Frisk.
4 people in one night in Queens. That's a policy of the NYPD.
Well,
here's another policy of the NYPD. The law says that if you have a small amount of marijuana on you and you don't display it in public, you don't have any legal ramification over that. People get stopped and frisked, and if they have that small amount of marijuana that has no legal ramification, if the cop takes it out of your pocket, once that happens, you get arrested for it.
Dee Dee's shaking her head. Dee Dee, what are you shaking your head about?
You know, I'm from Indiana, where everyone can have a gun. In New York, I can't have a gun to defend myself. So thank goodness you have stop and frisk, and you have a great police force that are monitoring the situation. That's right, like what you said. I mean, if it's 3 a.m. and people are running around, it looks like, you know, they're looking, and it doesn't matter if they're black, white, brown. That's not the issue. It's the activity. It's not the identity. It's the activity. And thank goodness for the police force keeping crime low in New York City. Thank you.
One at a time. One at a time. Carl, what's your response?
Stop and frisk doesn't operate that way. They're not looking at people who are suspicious. They are looking at people who are young and black. Ray Kelly told 3 state legislators in what he thought was a private meeting, he wanted every black and Latino youth in New York City to be afraid that they would be stopped and frisked when they leave the house in the morning. In other words, that's a criminal group to him. I'm going to treat them all as criminals. And that's my attack on crime.
So let me ask you this, Carl. If white people were stopped and frisked just as much as black people, would it not be as controversial?
It would still be wrong if they were just randomly, if it was a random overall police state, that would be wrong. What they have is a racially selective police state, and that is wrong. I'm not calling for more white people to be stopped.
Let me ask the panel.
I'm calling for the end of a program that targets people because of the color of their skin and stops them irrespective of any reason to suspect them of anything.
Okay, panel, what do you think about white New Yorkers being stopped and frisked? Is it necessary? Should it be more prevalent?
If there's reasonable suspicion, regardless of who they are.
One second, Carl, 1 second. I just want to give everybody equal time.
Yeah, I mean, you know, regardless of what their color is, if you're reasonable suspicion, that's how law enforcement should be trained. Are there, like Dee Dee said before, a few bad apples? Well, yes, let's not. There's 35,000 police officers, okay? It's a very small percentage that might be involved in something like that, but that's true in any kind of profession. The goal is to clear that up, okay? I'm a certified police academy instructor in New Jersey. I know what it takes to be a police officer in New Jersey.
Okay.
It's very competitive, very difficult. A lot of those people would be screened out early on, okay? Now, the training procedure I would think is similar in New York, but I don't know for a fact. There's 35,000, you know, police officers, so you may have a few that way, but you got to be careful of generalizations, you know, when we say that. And none of us know the totality of the circumstances when somebody was stopped. I mean,
we weren't there.
Right.
Clerk, what do you think?
I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. This doesn't work. First of all, right, the majority of people that are searched are between 18 and 24, and they're men of color, right? They're less than, what, 2% of all these stop and frisk results in guns being found? And I think we're still trying to make a correlation between, everyone wants public safety.
So what needs to be done? If you were the man in charge, in terms of this policy, what would you do?
We need to eliminate it. It doesn't work. Look at the numbers. I mean, everyone has an opinion, and opinions are great, right? But look at the numbers. They're not finding guns, right? Less than 10% of these stop and frisk results in arrests, but they're predominantly targeting communities of color, whereas the majority of people that are being incarcerated in the United States, right, are for drug offenses, and everyone uses drugs, but these are predominantly targeted.
Crime's not distributed evenly across the city. That's
they're targeting communities that have more crime. That's it. And you know what? Stop and frisk is a deterrent. I mean, if no officers are going to do that, it's a fear tactic.
It's not a deterrent. It doesn't work. How is it a deterrent? Other states that do not utilize stop and frisk, their crime rates have fallen just as much as ours. How do we explain that?
Well, I think that in New York City, I mean, it's such a big city, such a big concentration, and stop and frisk is a way that Ray Kelly and the officers, it's a deterrent, so folks know they're carrying guns if they're going to get caught.
In the 90s came out and said that stop and frisk is actually impacting communities in a traumatic fashion. He's reverse course, but he actually came out in the 90s and spoke about the trauma that is actually being inflicted on these communities.
I mean, is it scarring to
young boys and girls? As a black man walking out the streets,
I'd imagine
it's scary. It's scary knowing that at any point I could be pulled over, and the predominant reason why I could be pulled over and searched is because I'm black.
That's crazy. You keep saying that the police are racist. You're calling them all racist.
Look at the numbers. The majority
they're not racist.
I didn't call them racist.
You are. You're saying that they're doing it because it's race. It's not the case. If there are some, they need to be fired.
Let's put opinions aside, right? Who are the predominant amount of people that are being searched?
The people committing the crimes.
people.
No,
It's activity, not an identity.
It's in the communities
how are
where
they the
crime,
people committing the crimes
where
is less
crime
than
is
10
most prevalent.
if less
That's
than-
where the resources
If less
go.
than
It has
10% of the
nothing
people
to
that are
do
stop
with-
and frisk
it's
are
crime
being arrested.
It's crime first,
Crime
not
first.
color.
No.
That's my opinion.
Right.
Let's go back
I-
to Carl for a second.
Not real. Let's
Carl, what
talk
are you
about
saying?
drug use, illegal drug use. Is that concentrated among black people? Is that concentrated among
Absolutely.
Latinos?
Yes.
90%? No, it's not.
It's not.
Government figures say that people use illegal drugs pretty much in line with their existence in the population. And in fact, in the New York State polls, they find that white people use marijuana more than blacks or
And
Latinos.
stop and frisk them too.
Let's stop and
Well,
frisk.
those
Let's
are
do
the
it.
People get
I don't care
arrested
what color
for
they
this
are.
All right, guys,
black or
we got to
Latino.
take a break.
90% of the people in jail for marijuana possession are black or Latino. Why
They
is
wouldn't be in
that?
jail for marijuana
Because
possession.
that's where the cops go to look for.
Well, Carl, like John said, John's point is they wouldn't be in jail
No,
for
for just possession of marijuana.
possession,
That's
just
gotta be
possession
more than
specifically.
that, yeah.
Guys, we got to stop and not frisk, but stop and
Well,
take a
that's
break.
not true.
Carl, we got to
That
go
is
to
what
break, so
happens when
stop
you
for a
get
moment.
stopped
We will continue the conversation. Hold that thought, and we'll be right back on Fresh Outlook. Stay with us. Nice job, guys.